Presenting the Douglas DC-6, latest American transport airliner. Completely reversible pitch propellers make it possible for the plane to back up, an advantage in parking and storage. The DC-6 takes its place in the international development of peacetime world air travel. The takeoff is fast and smooth.
Night has a way of obscuring the truth. On September 17, 1961, the darkness over Central Africa held secrets that have never been fully revealed. A Douglas DC-6 plane, sleek and purposeful, skimmed above the rainforest canopy. On board was Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, and a man who had spent much of his life believing that words were stronger than bullets. He was not a celebrity, so he did not travel with a huge entourage. As he shuffled a deck of playing cards, his mission weighed heavy on his mind. He was to land in a rebellious province during a civil war and convince a secessionist leader to put down his arms. He was trying to keep Congo, the vast, resource-rich African nation whose cobalt, diamonds, and coltan had long tempted colonial powers and private companies, from becoming the chessboard upon which superpowers played. Instead of a rifle, he carried only the authority of the world's nations. Though the task ahead was Herculean, his demeanor showed no anxiety. He was calm, collected, perhaps concentrating on the worn deck in his hands. However, no one knows for sure what thoughts were running through his mind in that cabin, because only hours later, the plane would lie in pieces among the trees. In the sea of charred remains, a single playing card, the ace of spades to be specific, was tucked into Hammarskjöld's collar. At first, the crash appeared to be nothing more than a horrific accident. But the wreckage soon became a web of unanswered questions. An unburned body, ignored testimony of eyewitnesses, delays in rescue, and the ominous symbol of a card of death. To many observers, the fall of Hammarskjöld's plane is just one incident among countless Cold War mysteries. Yet this story reverberates far beyond any spy thriller. It was a rare moment when the death of a diplomat triggered conspiracies involving colonial history, racial prejudice, private armies, corporate greed, and global politics. To understand why his death resonates, we must retrace his life and unshuffle the deck of cards that drew him into the Congo's turmoil. To understand if this plane crash was an accident or an assassination. So hello everybody, today we're talking about the mystery of the playing card plane crash. This story's got it all. Conspiracies, Cold War politics, cover-ups and explosions, the works. Hopefully this is a good video to hopefully get back on the right track. As a lot of you have probably seen from social media, my wife and I recently had a kid, so as you can imagine, that takes up some time, as does crashing your dirt bike in your driveway, which if you listen to Creepcast, Hunter will tell you all about that very soon. In March, we should be back on weekly uploads, but we all appreciate your support in the interim of me not uploading at all. And then finally, hopefully, we can start making each other's 2026 a little bit better. But I know something else that can make your 2026 a little bit better. Cut to the sponsor. Yeah, sponsor. Now that we're out of the holiday season and the cold months are soon to be behind us, it may be time to think about a reset. Spring's right around the corner, and while you're cleaning up your home, why not clean up your home body? The body that you're in. It's kind of a home of sorts. With today's sponsor, AG1. That's because AG1 is the easy one-step solution to start putting the things in your body that your body's been missing. It contains your daily doses of multivitamins, multiminerals, pre and probiotics, superfoods. And instead of being a bunch of doses you have to keep up with, AG1 is one simple step, because all you need is 8 to 12 ounces of water and a spoonful of AG1 and you're good to go. And again, to clarify, AG1 isn't some miracle cure. It's just that if you're anything like me, I guarantee your diet isn't what it always should be. So thanks to AG1, I've been able to do things like have more energy throughout the day or be more productive at work. Because it's amazing what you can do with your body when you put the things into it that it's been missing out on. Now AG1 can help you from sun up to sun down thanks to AGZ. Another easy step to your nighttime ritual that helps you get to sleep and then stay there. So if you're looking for something to make the coming change of seasons easier on you, then now's the perfect time. That's because if you head to the link in the description at drinkag1.com/Wendigang, along with your order, you'll get the ultimate AG1 starter bundle. That includes things like a free welcome kit that includes a canister, a scoop, a shaker bottle, as well as 3 extra servings of AG1, 3 flavor sampler servings of AGZ, and a bottle of vitamin D3 and K2. Again, to get in on all of this, head to drinkag1.com/Wendigang to get in on this incredible offer today. Thank you all for watching the ad. Thank you to AG1 for sponsoring the channel. Their link will be in the description, and we are now back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. So let's talk about the life that led Hammarskjöld to that plane in the first place. When Dag Hamar Agni Karl Hammarskjöld, which is Swedish for mouthful, was born in July of 1905, Sweden stood formally neutral in European affairs, but sat at the edge of a continent simmering with nationalism and imperial ambitions. I mean, they would have 2 world wars over the next 4 decades. The eldest nations of Europe were arming themselves, and alliances were hardening, even though open warfare had not yet erupted. His father, Almer Hammarskjöld, served as Sweden's prime minister during the First World War, guiding the country through strict neutrality. Sweden's neutrality meant it abstained from joining alliances like the Central Powers or the Entente, trading cautiously with both sides while preserving its own borders and avoiding direct combat. Maintaining that balance demanded deft diplomacy and a calm temperament. Those qualities would shape Dag's worldview. His father also served on the Hague Tribunal, governed Uppland as its governor, and chaired the board of the Nobel Foundation. Breakfast conversations in the Hammarskjöld household revolved around diplomacy and duty as much as they did around porridge and biscuits. Principles, his father taught him, could shape nations, but compromise kept them standing. Young Dag absorbed these lessons while exploring Uppsala's forest. He became a skier and climber, eventually leading to the Swedish Alpinist Club. The mountains taught him caution and respect for natural forces. Those who knew him recalled his calm demeanor even on the most treacherous slopes. The combination of physical daring and intellectual discipline later helped him handle global crises without panic, or crises. Global crises, whatever. At Uppsala University, he earned a humanities degree in 1925, mastering English, French, and German. He learned early that diplomacy begins with listening, but he also recognized that culture alone could not solve economic injustices. So he pursued economics and law, earning degrees in 1928 and 1930 and a doctoral degree in 1934. This unusual combination of literature and finance gave him a perspective that few politicians possessed. He understood human stories and complex budgets. Dag briefly taught economics in Stockholm, but teaching felt too distant from the realities of the Depression. He soon joined the government commissions on unemployment, which at the time were concerned with the crisis of joblessness. Sweden was having a mass sweep of that in the 1930s, like the United States was. These commissions examined how the collapse of global markets had thrown workers out of factories and farms, and they developed policies for relief and job creation. It was in those meetings that Dag honed his ability to listen, to negotiate, and to find pragmatic solutions to thorny problems. His analytical skills and calm pragmatism caught the attention of Sweden's central bank. Over the next 2 decades, he rose quietly through financial institutions. Colleagues later remarked that his strong work ethic, his knack for relating to people from all backgrounds, and his habit of letting silence speak for him all contributed to his rapid ascent. He became secretary and later head of the Bank of Sweden, taking the helm during a period when economies were fragile from war and recovery. During his tenure, he negotiated trade agreements with the United States and played a key role in Sweden's participation in the Marshall Plan, which was the US-backed program that pumped billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe after World War II. His meticulous and unemotional negotiating style made him an asset. He would listen to each side and search for compromises that maintained stability. Unlike many politicians, he didn't use gaudy language or embellish his words or speak just to hear his own voice. For him, silence could be as powerful as speech. By the late 1940s, Dag had joined Sweden's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and by 1951, he effectively served as deputy foreign minister. He still had not joined a political party. Independence was a badge of honor. He represented Sweden at the United Nations, where colleagues noticed his ability to bridge ideological divides. The UN was a young organization, struggling to define its role in a world polarized by the United States and the Soviet Union. After the unexpected resignation of Secretary General Trygve Lie, the Security Council needed a neutral candidate. In 1953, Hammarskjöld was elected Secretary General with an almost unanimous 57 out of 60 votes. Carrying a sense of duty from his father, he treated the role as a moral mission more than merely a bureaucratic duty. He coined the term preventive diplomacy, the idea that a crisis should be addressed before it erupts into a full-blown war. This belief guided his interventions across the Middle East and Asia. During the Suez Crisis of 1956, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, and Britain, France, and Israel responded with force. Hammarskjöld quietly worked behind the scenes to broker a ceasefire. Under his leadership, the UN created its first peacekeeping force, the United Nations Emergency Force, marking a historic expansion of the Secretary General's role. He insisted that the Secretary General could not simply be a clerk. He had to act when nations were unwilling or unable to resolve disputes. By 1957, Dag secured re-elections for a second term, indicating widespread trust in his leadership. Yet Dag's independent approach earned him powerful enemies. He refused to align fully with either US or Soviet superpowers. He resisted US pressure to condemn socialist states and declined Soviet demands to denounce Western colonialism. Both Washington and Moscow were irritated by a leader they could not control. He insisted the UN should have the authority to deploy peacekeepers without endless debates, a stance that angered governments that wanted to keep the organization weak. This conviction would soon be tested in Central Africa, where colonial legacies and Cold War politics collided. It's difficult to overstate how resource-rich the Congo is. It's come up a lot over on Wendigoon lately. Both the Jameson Cannibal video and the Heart of Darkness video talked about how resource-rich the Congo was and why everyone wanted a piece of the pie. Beneath its soil lies plentiful deposits of cobalt, diamonds, gold, copper, and coltan, the very minerals that fuel industry and technology, from jet engines to smartphones. Yet for centuries, these riches brought exploitation rather than prosperity. As mentioned in the two aforementioned videos, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo as his personal possession in 1884. He promised to civilize and develop the territory. Instead, his agents instituted one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history. Villagers were forced to meet quotas for rubber and ivory, and failure resulted in beatings, mutilation, and even death. Soldiers severed people's hands to prove they had punished rebellious workers. 10 to 12 million Congolese may have died under Leopold's rule, before international outrage forced him to finally cede control to the Belgian government in 1908. The Belgian state may have improved infrastructure, but it maintained racial hierarchies. The Belgians built railways and exploited mines, while Congolese workers received meager wages and few rights, a step up from their time under Leopold, if only barely. During both world wars, the colony supplied raw materials and troops for Allied war effort. Uranium from the Congo later fueled the Manhattan Project's atomic bombs. And through all this, Congolese citizens remained largely disenfranchised. After World War II, the winds of decolonialization swept across Africa. Colonial powers were weakened, and indigenous movements demanded independence. In the Congo, strikes and protests erupted against poor conditions and low pay. The Belgian government promised reforms but delivered them so slowly that there was hardly any progress. Meanwhile, the Cold War intensified the situation. Both the Soviet Union and the United States coveted Congo's minerals, especially uranium and copper, and sought allies among Congolese leaders. As independence loomed, each superpower wanted to steer the country towards its own sphere of influence. The Congo's strategic wealth had made it a Cold War hotspot. On June 30th, 1960, the Congo declared independence. There were celebrations in Leopoldville, now named Kinshasa, as you can imagine they changed the name eventually, with Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba delivering a fiery speech condemning Belgian colonialism, while President Joseph Kasavubu offered remarks more worthy of an olive branch. The new government was fragile, representing a coalition of regional interests. Many of the soldiers in the Force Publique, the National Army, were still commanded by Belgian officers. But within a week, Congolese soldiers mutinied. On July 5th, 1960, they rebelled against their Belgian officers, demanding higher pay and more authority. Violence erupted across the country. In some towns, mutinous soldiers looted shops, assaulted European civilians, and targeted anyone perceived to be in league with the colonial regime. European families fled or barricaded themselves as rumors spread of atrocities. These events unsettled the world. Newspapers printed headlines about attacks on missionaries and the brutal retribution of soldiers. Belgium responded by sending troops without consulting the Congolese government, ostensibly to protect its citizens. Lumumba and Kasavubu appealed to the United Nations, hoping that a neutral force could drive out Belgian troops and restore order. Dag at the UN acted quickly and launched Operation des Nations Unies à Congo, or ONUC for short. The UN sent peacekeepers into the Congo to remove foreign troops and stabilize the country. This was the largest peacekeeping effort the United Nations had ever undertaken, and it was the first time that a UN force had attempted to enforce the sovereign state of a newly independent nation. The United Nations initially supported ONUC, but after the UN refused to intervene in the secession efforts of a local province called Katanga, Prime Minister Lumumba threatened to invite Soviet assistance, much to the alarm of Washington. I mean, it was the 1960s. The United States isn't going to be cool if you all of a sudden get the Russians involved. CIA Station Chief Lawrence Devlin warned that the Congo could become a communist satellite, and thus US officials, including President Dwight D. Eisenhower, considered removing Lumumba by any means necessary, wink wink. I mean, we saw in the Philippines that they were willing to pretend to be vampires to get that guy out when he was sympathetic to the Soviet Union. If Lumumba wants to invite the Russians, well, maybe we can find some werewolves. Editor, be sure to put a picture of the thumbnail from my Vampire Philippine video on screen so that sentence was at least slightly legible. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, offered to provide advisors and equipment to aid Lumumba to prevent Katanga's secession. Dag suddenly found himself mediating not just between African factions, but between the world's two foremost superpowers in the middle of a Cold War. I mean, think about it. The Congo's declared independence. That's great. We're all happy with that, right? So naturally, the people in the Congo want the influence of the Belgians out. Makes sense. But there's also a bunch of people who are just living in the Congo from European nations, and they probably shouldn't just die, right? So the UN comes in to mediate that, but then when the UN isn't doing everything the local leaders want them to do, the local leaders are like, we'll just tell Russia to do it. So then the United States is like, oh, did somebody say Russia? So suddenly they want to be involved and they're threatening to assassinate people and send in like a kabillion troops. So suffice to say, this has become a pretty complicated situation. Katanga would prove to be a linchpin in both the Congo's independence and the life of Dag Hammarskjöld. Even as Congolese troops mutinied elsewhere, a man named Moise Chambé declared the mineral-rich province of Katanga independent on July 11, 1960. Chambé was a charismatic businessman and the leader of the Connaught Party. He hoped to create a loose confederation of provinces rather than a strong centralized state, an arrangement that would give Katanga control over its mines without interference from the central government. Chambé's vision appealed to Belgian interest because it would allow companies like Union Minière de Hout Katanga to continue managing and profiting from copper and cobalt operations. Independence for Katanga meant hoisting its own flag, forming its own police force, and inviting European mercenaries to defend its territory. Belgium supplied military advisors, and French and British officials tacitly supported the breakaway province, seeing an opportunity to maintain influence in Central Africa. You can see how this creates a problem. Congo wants to be independent and kick the European influence out, but then one region in Katanga says that they want independence from the independents, and as part of their super independence, they want to bring the Europeans back in as their own police state and to do business with. Many Congolese outside Katanga saw the secession as a betrayal. Their brand new nation was already fracturing, threatening to unravel the dream of independence before it began. Katangans themselves were split. Some welcomed Chambé's promises of prosperity, while others feared becoming pawns of foreign mining companies. You know, again. Katanga's secession posed a serious challenge for our man Dag. ONUC's mandate was to preserve Congo's territorial integrity while remaining neutral. If the UN intervened directly in Katanga, it risked being perceived as taking sides, and if it allowed Katanga to break away, then it would set a precedent for corporate-backed secessions. You know, when the point or influence of a secession is for a company to maintain a financial interest in the area. For example, Union Minière invested in Katanga's breakaway government by paying salaries and hiring mercenaries. If such secessions succeeded, other provinces might follow suit, turning resource-rich regions into quasi-states run by private interests. Imagine if Washington State was renamed Amazonville, or if Texas became known as Chevrolet Land, or if a region within the Amazon rainforest was known as Fordlandia. The last one happened. I don't mean to keep plugging my own videos in these videos, but you know, that's just how it happens sometimes. This would leave the central government powerless and the local population subject to corporate governance, possibly taking the people who live there back to the days of King Leopold's rule. Initially, Dag's UN refused to act against Katanga, focusing instead on expelling Belgian soldiers from other regions. Lumumba, growing increasingly frustrated with the UN's caution, considered turning to the Soviets, as mentioned. This decision, coupled with his outspoken criticism of Belgian and US interference, increased American fears and contributed to plans to remove him from power. Dag knew that he had a very thin rope to walk on, and if he fell in any direction, it would be a full-on disaster. As political instability escalated, on September 5th of 1960, President Kasavubu dismissed Prime Minister Lumumba. Lumumba responded by declaring Kasavubu deposed, insisting instead that only Parliament had authority to remove him. To the outside world, this was confusing. Two leaders each claimed that the other had been dismissed. The stalemate paralyzed government functions. Ministers refused to carry out orders, and regional leaders acted independently. In this vacuum, Colonel Joseph Mobutu, then head of the Congolese National Army, seized the moment. On September 14th, he launched a coup, proclaiming himself head of the government. So you have the two people who were in charge who each tell the other that they're fired, and this third guy steps in and says he's actually in charge now. And you may ask, what gave this Mobutu guy the power to step up to the throne? Well, because he had the interest of the mines in mind, he had the backing of Belgium, but he also had friends at the CIA. That's right, Mobutu's regime was to expel the Soviet influence, so the CIA helped him take power. And after he did, Lumumba was placed under house arrest and later transferred to Katanga, where he was executed in January of 1961. Mobutu's rise signaled a new era. Over time, he would consolidate power, renamed the country Zaire, and became one of Africa's most notorious dictators. So add another dollar to our times the CIA instrumented a coup that led to a dictatorship jar. I have one of those somewhere. It's got at least like $4 in it. But in 1961, his hold was precarious. Katanga remained independent, and UN peacekeepers clashed intermittently with Shambai's mercenaries. These clashes were often chaotic. UN soldiers equipped with lightly armored vehicles traded fire with European mercenaries flying small attack planes. At times, Katanga's aircraft strafed UN convoys or dropped bombs on supply lines. In one engagement, UN forces attempted to seize control of the provincial capital, Elizabethville, only to be repelled by mercenary pilots who strafed the airport. The United Nations learned the hard way that maintaining neutrality in a civil war could mean being shot at by both sides. Dag, watching events spiral, felt compelled to intervene personally. He believed that direct negotiation might achieve what diplomacy from afar had not, persuading Shambai to end his rebellion and bring Katanga back into the Congo. So finally, getting to the plane crash of this story, late on September 17, 1961, Dag boarded the DC-6 Albertina in Leopoldville. The plan was simple: fly to Ndola, a mining town in northern Rhodesia, and negotiate with Shambai and return quickly. With him were members of his staff, pilots, and crew. There's a discrepancy regarding the number of passengers. Some sources list 16, but the official UN record acknowledges 15. Even this small detail underscores how straightforward facts have become contested. The plane took off and, by all accounts, flew without incident across the Congo, entering northern Rhodesian airspace. Air traffic controllers cleared the Albertina for landing sometime between midnight and 15:15. But the plane never made it to the runway. British officials, including High Commissioner Lord Alport, waited to greet the Secretary General at the airport. When the plane did not appear, Alport speculated that Hammarskjöld had diverted to another airfield for reasons unknown. In an astonishing lapse in judgment that sounds too stupid to be real, the control tower eventually turned off the lights and just closed the airport. The guy calls and says he'll be landing in 15 minutes, and when he never shows up, you're like, well, I guess shift's over, we can all go home. Meanwhile, local villagers saw and heard something terrifying. They described watching a plane approach, its lights blinking in the dark sky. Then there was a flash, followed by a roaring noise and fire. One witness said the aircraft descended like a falling star, trailing flames before vanishing into the forest. These vivid accounts would contrast sharply with the sterile language of official reports. Despite the alarming sights and sounds of the crash, it took over 15 hours for rescue teams to arrive at the site. For reasons never fully explained, authorities delayed search efforts even after multiple reports of one or more explosions. By the time responders reached the wreckage, the fuselage was largely burned, and most bodies were charred beyond recognition. Strangely, Dag's body was unburned, but how he was found is what was so disturbing. He was found lying on his back, propped against a termite mound. His glasses were intact with a playing card, the ace of spades, tucked carefully into his shirt. That image, simultaneously macabre and theatrical, has fueled speculation ever since. Sergeant Harold Julian, the secretary officer on the flight, survived the crash but suffered burns on half his body, in addition to a fractured skull and a dislocated ankle. He remained conscious and able to speak briefly before succumbing to his injuries days later. Investigators interviewed Julian in the hospital, and when asked what happened, he responded simply, quote, "It blew up." Julian described a sensation of great speed followed by a sudden crash, which is how I think most plane crashes would be described, and mentioned that there had been small explosions around him but gave no clear timeline. It wasn't until later that he would tell his wife that he had heard 3 distinct explosions. Dr. Mark Lowenthal, who treated him, recalled that Julian also said Dag ordered the plane to turn back before impact. Some believe these statements suggest the possibility of an onboard bomb or some kind of mid-air attack, but they're ambiguous, as you could imagine. Julian might have offered more detail, but Rhodesian officials restricted access to him. A senior intelligence officer instructed hospital staff not to discuss his statements. Seems kind of weird for a normal plane crash, right? The staff isn't allowed to discuss things they hear the victim say happened in the plane crash. Investigators speculated that authorities feared he would describe an explosion or the sighting of another aircraft. I mean, according to his testimony, it sounds like that's what Dag saw right before the crash happened. Dr. Lowenthal later regretted not ordering Julian's immediate transfer to a better hospital. Perhaps more timely treatment could have saved his life and preserved his testimony. So with his death, the only witnesses we have are the eyewitnesses on the ground. The crash occurred near an African township outside of Ndola. Residents there say they saw 2 airplanes flying closer together than usual and heard an explosion before the larger plane fell. Now, Dag was in one airplane, and that airplane did not need another airplane. So witnesses saying they saw 2 airplanes and the smaller one made the bigger one blow up certainly sounds like they got shot down. Davidson Simango, a local charcoal burner, described seeing one plane trailing a smaller one. The smaller plane fired what looked like a flame at the larger aircraft, which then crashed. Another witness, Dixon Bulini, offered a similar story. Both men were everyday workers living near the crash site, and their statements align with claims that a fighter aircraft attacked the UN plane. Yet the official inquiry dismissed these accounts. The Rhodesian Civil Aviation Board and later UN investigators largely ignored these testimonies. In part, this dismissal may have stemmed from the deeply rooted racial prejudice of Rhodesian society. Ndola was part of a larger federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, where segregation was law. Black residents lived in separate townships away from the Europeans. Prime Minister Roy Welensky openly compared the relationship between white and black residents to that between a rider and a horse. So, under such a system, testimonies from black witnesses were often considered unreliable. To give you an idea of how bad this was, official crash reports labeled bodies by their nationality, and the one Haitian victim, Sergeant Serge Barrow, was labeled as colored. It wasn't just the physical evidence that went missing, voices were erased. Either these voices were not valued because of who they came from, or officials were burying a narrative, or a bit of both. In the immediate aftermath, the Rhodesian Civil Aviation Board launched an investigation. Their November 1961 report could not identify a definitive cause. It suggested pilot error as one possibility, but acknowledged that an unknown person might have forced the plane to descend into trees, which is a really wild thing to say. Like, yeah, I mean, it was probably the pilot's fault the plane crashed. There's also a chance, not naming any names, that someone hypothetically crashed the plane, but our official finding is maybe that person was the pilot, maybe. A UN investigation in 1962 examined the possibility that a bomb had been planted, noting that the aircraft had been left unattended for 2 hours before takeoff in Leopoldville, a window during which someone could have placed an explosive. However, investigators found no physical evidence of explosives, or at least they didn't publicly say that they found any physical evidence of explosives. Most importantly, none of these theories explained the unusual state under which Hammarskjöld's body had been discovered, nor an explanation for the ominous playing card left tucked in his shirt. Despite the lack of hard proof, the notion of sabotage gained traction because eyewitness accounts mentioned flashes and explosions, and because the official explanation seemed to gloss over glaring irregularities. Some of these irregularities were major, which marred the original investigation. There was a 9-hour delay in locating the wreckage, for example, and air traffic control notes were reconstructed days later. The dimming of the airport lights immediately after the crash was further cause for question. Witnesses say they saw Europeans in fatigues near the wreck before official rescuers arrived. The Rhodesian inquiry, conducted under colonial authority, may have been politically constrained and incompetent at best, or intentionally deceptive at worst. I mean, there were all kinds of people who wanted the UN out of Africa. To many, it wasn't a question of if something malicious happened, but who? Decades would pass with no closure. In December of 2022, so like 3 years ago, former Tanzanian Chief Justice Mohamed Chande Othman compiled a report for Secretary General Antonio Guterres. His findings included, quote, significant new information, possible intercepts of radio communications related to the crash, evidence that Katanga's armed forces or foreign mercenaries had the capacity to attack the plane, and reports of paramilitary and intelligence operatives active in the Ndola region that night. Which would make sense. Katanga had mercenary backing that included things like airplanes that, they would use to attack the UN supply lines. It's not a huge jump to say those planes could attack a UN plane. Othman concluded that an external attack remained plausible, though sabotage or pilot error cannot be ruled out. He stressed that crucial information likely resides in the archives of certain member states. Notably, the United States, United Kingdom, and Belgium had not fully complied with UN requests for declassification, further adding to suspicion. A 2024 UN update added that US intelligence agencies, including the NSA and CIA, had very likely recorded all local radio traffic in Ndola on the night of the crash. 2 US personnel, Charles Southall and Abram, confirmed they overheard or reviewed a recording related to an attack on the flight. So that's 2 US agents who were listening in to radio traffic on that night saying they heard a recording relating to taking down the UN plane, but neither agency has released those intercepts, and their silence fuels speculation that something is being concealed, which I wouldn't call it speculation at this point. It's very clear that something is being concealed. If you ever watch shows like CSI, Criminal Minds, or Law & Order, you know the one thing to look for in this case is motive. And here the motive came down to one question. Who'd want Dag Hammarskjöld dead? And the answer to that is simple. The Congo crisis jeopardized several powerful interests. Western mining companies feared losing access to copper, cobalt, and uranium along with the nation's independence. Since, their independence let them have all those things. Dag's efforts to reunify the Congo threatened to nationalize and regulate those resources, costing a few powerful people a lot of money. Since if Katanga became a part of the Congo again, then that would mean that Katanga had to lose the Western influence, and the West didn't like that so much. Intelligence agencies like the CIA, MI6, and KGB all operated in the region, seeking to steer the Congo towards governments friendly to their own agendas. And Chambe's mission in favor of an independent Katanga had an emotional, visceral action that rallied mercenaries and pitted Congolese against each other. Hammarskjöld's attempts to convince Katanga to reunify with Zaire undermined that mission. In other words, many stood to benefit from Hammarskjöld's removal. A unified Congo under a neutral leader would reduce the leverage of superpowers, while peace might lead to nationalization and economic losses for corporations. No matter the result, someone powerful had something big to lose if Hammarskjöld got what he wanted, a unified state. Former US President Harry Truman gave perhaps the most provocative statement on the matter. The day after the crash, he remarked that Dag, quote, was on the point of getting something done when they killed him. Coming from a man who authorized atomic bombings, this remark carries some weight. So if the crash was not due to mechanical error, then what? Well, there's 3 primary theories that dominate discussion: a bomb, Operation Celeste, and the lone mercenary pilot. None of which is conclusive, but each reveals deeper layers of complicity and moral rot. So, first, let's look at the bomb theory. The bomb theory remains the simplest explanation. It requires minimal coordination. Someone with access to the plane plants an explosive timed to detonate before final descent. Supporters point to Sergeant Julian's description of multiple small explosions and to the 2-hour window during which the Albertina was left unguarded on the tarmac. They also note that the Ace of Spades, sometimes called the Death card, could have been placed by the saboteur as an ominous signature. I mean, with ground crews taking so long to visit the site, there would have been time to manipulate the remains however was seen fit. The saboteur could have planted the bomb and then drive to the wreckage after the explosion, or coordinated with someone locally to drive out to the wreckage after the explosion. In wars, soldiers have left calling cards on bodies as warnings. American troops in Vietnam used the Ace of Spades to intimidate opponents. Could the same symbolism have been employed here, or was the card an intentional misdirection designed to implicate the United States? I mean, if there's belief of CIA influence in the region, then leaving a American-related calling card on this body in Africa would certainly point towards them. The bomb theory's weakness is the lack of physical evidence. Investigators found no blast residue on the wreckage, which you could just say the investigators lied about blast residue, but then we reach a dead end where, aside from a confession, there's no way to definitively prove or disprove it. Without forensic proof, the theory remains a possibility rather than a conclusion. So let's move on to our second theory, Operation Celeste. In the late 1990s, documents discovered in apartheid-era archives in South Africa alleged that a white militia group called the South African Institute for Maritime Research orchestrated the crash with backing from British intelligence and the CIA. The documents claim that CIA Director Alan Dulles and unnamed British officials approved a covert plan to assassinate Dag. According to this narrative, the operation involved planting a bomb on the Albertina and deploying a fighter plane as a backup to ensure destruction. The plan supposedly involved resources from Union Miniere, linking corporate interests directly to the assassination. In this theory, the Ace of Spades would have been a CIA signature. The story fits with the documented racism of apartheid and the willingness of Western intelligence agencies to collaborate with extremist groups when convenient. The South African Institute for Maritime Research, or SAMR, was led by Keith Maxwell, a man who presented himself as a doctor, but who, according to testimonies, conducted sinister experiments in his clinics. Alex Jones, and no, not to be confused with the Alex Jones, another person just named Alex Jones, was a former SAMR operative and described the organization as a mercenary force with up to 5,000 members, conducting coups and assassinations across Africa. He claimed Maxwell executed subordinates, wore an 18th century Commodore's uniform, and sought to maintain white supremacy in the region at any cost. Jones believed SAMR killed Dag with CIA and MI6 backing. The alleged Operation Celeste, which was named after the Latin phrase for "of the sky," reads like a screenplay, but its roots lie in documented racial violence and corporate greed. Now, the major shortcoming of this theory is the veracity of the evidence. For all we know, the documents may be forgeries. Their authenticity has never been verified, and again, they just showed up in the 90s. Jones admitted to destroying evidence and provided no paper trail or names of other witnesses. He just had the whole testimony on his own that didn't list anyone else, except for leaders that were now long gone to prosecute. Without corroborating documents or intelligence intercepts, Operation Celeste remains an allegation, but it illustrates how extremism, corporate power, and Cold War geopolitics could have conspired to remove a problem like Dag. So finally, let's look at the lone mercenary theory. The mercenary pilot theory centers on Jan van Rissinghem, a Belgian with a background in wartime aviation. Jan flew for the Katangese secessionist forces, piloting a French trainer jet known as the Fouga Magister. Which, keep in mind, the Katanga secessionist forces, or the people that want to keep Katanga out of the larger Congo, are the ones who would most likely want Dag dead. In the documentary Cold Case Hammarskjöld, U.S. naval officer Charles Southall, which if you'll remember is one of the two people who said that they heard a recording relating to the shooting down or blowing up of the plane that night, Southall described hearing a recording of a mercenary pilot bragging that he had seen a transport plane, gone down to take a look, fired, and watched it crash. Southall did not know at the time that the plane carried Dag Hammarskjöld. If such a recording exists, it strongly suggests a deliberate shoot down. So the pilot said that he deliberately shot it down. Rissinghem's friend Pierre Coppens later testified that Rissinghem admitted to attacking the UN plane before his death. Rissinghem's flight log reportedly contains gaps around the time of the crash, and his widow's irritated response to journalists who pressed her for details hints that the topic is a sensitive one. Some skeptics argue that even if a mercenary pilot fired on the plane, he would likely have needed authorization from a higher authority, and that it was unlikely such orders would be given on a UN plane. But at the same time, these are mercenaries, right? And without knowing exactly how well structured these forces were, it's hard to say for sure if that pilot would need permission from up top or if he could just shoot down planes that he wanted to shoot down, since, they were already warring with the UN at the time. There may have been little in terms of responsibility or a heavily regulated chain of command. I mean, they're mercenaries. But there remains the possibility that orders came not from the mercenaries' direct report, but rather outside influence. As such, there was and still is some speculation that the CIA or the British may have been involved. The UN's 2024 update noted that the NSA likely recorded regional radio traffic. And as mentioned earlier, 2 US personnel claimed to have overheard or reviewed a recording of an attack. If those tapes confirm Southall's account, the mercenary pilot theory gains weight. Till they're released, however, it remains unproven. an outcome that's highly unlikely. I mean, look at how many teeth we needed to pull to get a few of the names of people that were involved in the largest sex trafficking ring ever. Do you think the CIA is just going to willingly hand over evidence that they were complicit in the murder of the head of the UN? No. Beyond conspiracies, the case reveals systemic issues on the continent during this time. As mentioned, at the time of the investigation, there were on-the-ground reports that said they saw another plane in the sky. Reports from people who had no interest one way and the other, or probably didn't even know what planes were involved. But of course, these statements were rejected simply because they were black. Things like that, along with the labeling of the bodies, shows us a broader mindset. As Louis Armstrong famously said when he visited Rhodesia in the 1960s, quote, "The country knew how to keep black children barefoot." Hammarskjöld himself was aware of this injustice, and he condemned apartheid and believed in self-determination. His willingness to fly into a conflict zone signaled respect for African autonomy. Yet with his death, his voice, like many others in the region, was silenced. After his death, the world reacted with shock. In Sweden, news of Dag's death spread quickly. The government announced that theaters and dance halls would close on designated days of mourning, and all schools would be closed for his funeral. The state funeral on September 29, 1961, at Uppsala Cathedral drew dignitaries from across the world. King Gustav VI Adolf, Queen Louise, and former U.S. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt attended. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, later President, and UN Ambassador Adlai Stevenson represented the United States. The funeral was somber. Sweden mourned not just a national hero, but an international servant. President John F. Kennedy later reflected, quote, "I realize now that in comparison to him, I am a small man. He was the greatest statesman of our century." Such praise underscored the esteem in which Hammarskjöld was held, even by those who disagreed with him, and possibly had some involvement in killing him. Dag's death did not immediately end the Katanga crisis. Fighting continued. ONUC forces, reinforced with troops from countries like India and Sweden, engaged with mercenaries, slowly regaining territory. January of 1963, after more than 2 years of sporadic clashes and negotiations, the secession was finally crushed and Katanga reintegrated into the Congo. But the victory was bittersweet. Political instability persisted. Mobutu consolidated power, ruling as a dictator for decades. The Congo, renamed Zaire and later the Democratic Republic of Congo, remained a state for proxy wars and corporate exploitation. In the 1970s and 80s, the regime granted lucrative mining concessions to foreign firms, while ordinary Congolese saw little benefit. Rebel groups emerged, sometimes backed by neighboring countries, and these cycles of conflict showed how the unresolved issues of 1960 still haunted the nation. Meanwhile, the UN reevaluated its peacekeeping strategies. The Congo mission exposed challenges in deploying multinational forces without clear mandates. Although ONUC succeeded in removing foreign troops and ending Katanga's secession, it could not prevent internal power grabs or ensure long-term stability. As soon as one problem was over, someone else came to power or tried to come to power, kicking a new conflict off. Lessons from the Congo informed later operations in Cyprus, Bosnia, and Rwanda, which, things went without a hitch there. In Bosnia, UN peacekeepers discovered the limits of neutrality when they were powerless to stop the massacre in Srebrenica. In Rwanda, a small UN mission faced genocide and lacked both mandate and manpower. Each time, debates about neutrality, the use of force, and the protection of civilians echoed the dilemmas first confronted in the Congo. It's often difficult to influence powerful actors without taking an equally hard line. If someone approaches the table with guns and massacres, often talking can't do much. This is the whole philosophy of war, power, and control summarized in one lesson, something that the United Nations has come to understand, which is why now, in most cases, to avoid escalating matters, their missions handcuff, often to the point of futility. And it seems that trend kicked off with the plane that was shot down over Rhodesia. Over 6 decades have passed, and the full truth behind the crash remains elusive. Each theory reveals something about the era. A bomb points to sabotage by unknown actors. Operation Celeste hints at hidden alliances between Western governments and local militias, and the mercenary pilot theory underscores the murky world of private soldiers. Underlying them all is the shadow of the Cold War, when superpowers viewed every regional conflict as a potential domino. The refusal of intelligence agencies to declassify records suggests that secrets may embarrass powerful institutions. In the absence of hard facts, speculation thrives. But the story's power does not depend solely on uncovering the exact mechanism of the crash. It rests on understanding the intersection of personal conviction and complex global realities. Hammarskjöld was not a flawless hero. Obviously, he made mistakes and wielded considerable power. Of course, this video is looking at a single instance of his life, and there's a ton to criticize with his handling of previous geopolitical issues. A lot of people still have a lot to say about the Suez Crisis, yet he believed that diplomacy could create space for smaller nations to make their own choices, and he recognized that peace is more than the absence of war. It's the presence of fairness. When he flew into Katanga, he did so because he hoped his presence might encourage moderation. I mean, there's not a lot of leaders that don't just talk about a war zone, they fly into it. And in a world where leaders often avoid danger, his choice stands out. The crash also serves as a reminder of how quickly history can pivot. Had Hammarskjöld succeeded in persuading Shanbei, Congo's post-independence history might have unfolded differently. Perhaps a negotiated settlement could have prevented years of dictatorship. Perhaps the UN would have gained more legitimacy. Perhaps a unified Congo would have avoided later wars and become pawns of bad actors. Think about how much might have changed if that plane had not have crashed. Or alternatively, Hammarskjöld's death may have been inevitable, because forces opposed to peace were more powerful than one man could overcome. The tragic thing is, we'll never know. But what we can know is that after his death, the world lost a diplomat whose mixture of humility and resolve remains rare. The United Nations also lost a leader who believed the organization could act independently of national interests. His death reminded the world that even the highest office offers no protection when powerful actors decide that someone must be removed. The only thing we're left to ask is who that someone was. One detail continues to fascinate anyone who hears about the case: the ace of spades found in Hammarskjöld's collar. In some cultures, the card represents bad luck or death. The presence of the card on Hammarskjöld's body cannot be easily dismissed as coincidence. It's not like the plane crashed and then his body was thrown perfectly intact onto a termite hill upright with the card in his collar. It may have been planted by someone who wanted to signal that the death was a message, or it could have been a random artifact from the plane's cargo, simply put in his collar to show that this was a purposeful hit. Interestingly, the card was not mentioned in official autopsy reports. So was the card a symbol meant to send a message? And if not, then why omit it? And again, assuming eyewitness testimonies are true, the move reeks again of a cover-up. The ambiguity illustrates how the human mind grasps at symbols to make sense of tragedy. People weave narratives connecting disparate details until meaning emerges. Conspiracies are often dismissed as paranoid fantasies, but history shows that governments and corporations have orchestrated clandestine operations. Once again, like 10 years ago, saying that the higher-ups of our government and other governments are trading children for illicit reasons, which I guess there's not a reason you would trade children for altruistic reasons. Saying that would have been a completely out of left field, insano conspiracy theory. And look, here we are. Isn't that great? During the Cold War, the CIA and MI6 participated in coups in Iran and Guatemala. The Belgian government employed mercenaries and manipulated Congo's politics. South Africa's apartheid regime carried out assassinations and destabilized neighboring countries. In this context, the idea that Dag's plane was targeted isn't implausible. As to who was behind it, we're no closer to definitive answers than we are to knowing precisely how the plane was brought down. UN cannot force its members to release classified information, and national governments will always prioritize their own interest in security over us just knowing what happened. The truth may lie buried in archives, in personal diaries, or in the memories of those who have since passed. The lack of closure can and is frustrating, but it invites us to question what we expect from official narratives. History is often written by the victors, sanitized by committees, and archived by bureaucrats. Sometimes the most honest account is found in the testimonies of ordinary people. The charcoal burners who saw two planes, the doctor who lamented his patient's fate, the wife who heard her dying husband whisper about explosions. Their voices might not fit into official reports, but they remind us that events are experienced by human beings, not by abstractions. And because those voices weren't in official reports, might mean they're the only ones we can trust. For those who believe Dag was murdered, the case symbolizes the lengths to which powerful players will go to protect their interests. For those who think it was an accident, it underscores the randomness of death. For everyone, it's a lesson in humility. Even the most principled leaders are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. Even the most well-intentioned institutions can fail to deliver justice. And even the most detailed investigations can leave us with questions, especially, if those investigations might have potentially had some motives. As we picture the Albertina cutting through the night sky, carrying a man who believed in peace toward a region on the brink of war, we might remember that courage often looks quiet. Looks like boarding a plane when you could have stayed in New York. Looks like listening to voices that others ignore, and it looks like believing that diplomacy is not futile. Whether Dag's plane was brought down by sabotage, mercenaries' gunfire, or tragic error, His legacy invites us to hold our institutions accountable and to keep asking questions, even when answers, or especially when answers, are inconvenient. Perhaps the most radical act we can perform is one of the easiest: to refuse to accept official stories at face value. My opinion, I think the plane getting shot down is the most likely. You had two unrelated witnesses who said they saw a second smaller plane that had fire come out of it, and then that plane exploded, which lines up with the dying pilot's account of explosions or gunshots hitting the plane. I think it's not a question of if Dag was murdered, but how. And with that many people with a motive, we'll probably never know for sure. It's a weird historical mystery that I don't see talked about a lot, and I wanted to share with you all, and hopefully you enjoyed in whatever capacity you can enjoy these kind of things, which I say that's pretty cool, and we just want to say thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little Cold War narrative. Again, there will be more content on the way soon, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Thank you guys for the support you've been showing over here. It really does mean the world. I believe the next video is on a disappearance, so stick around for that if you're interested. But above all else, that should do it for now, and we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye! The only opinion I really think is stupid in this whole thing is that the plane just crashed. Like, that important of a guy was flying over this important of a region, and everyone says there was some explosion, some mutiny, but there's still people out there who think the plane just did that. I swear, if 9/11, like the World Trade Center getting hit, wasn't on video, there would be people who think buildings can just blow up sometimes. Like, there'd be all these people debating like if planes hit it or if it was an inside attack, and then there'd be a group of people like, have we ever considered that, buildings just explode on occasion? Curious.